Back in the 2000s, gaming was just slowly starting to gain popularity in the mainstream. And because of that, we saw a lot more companies trying new things to get gamers excited to buy their products. With all that trial came some error, as we saw a ton of weird and gimmicky products, especially when it came to new tech, gaming consoles, games, and even peripherals. As a notorious gaming enthusiast kid back then, I witnessed a lot of crazy, weird, and cool products in the gaming sphere, thanks to places like YouTube and G4 TV. Today we're going to reminisce and take a look back at some of the most intriguing, weird, and goofy failed products of the 2000s that you might not have seen growing up like I did. The late 80s is when the concept of the handheld gaming console was in its infancy. You had things like Nintendo's Game & Watch, and even before then in the late 70s, there was the Milton Bradley Microvision that allowed players to play games portably via cartridges, an unheard of idea at the time. Years later, Nintendo would go on to follow up their Game & Watch with the now iconic Game Boy in 1989, inspired directly from the innovation of the Microvision a decade before. Of course, the Game Boy would go on to be a massive success and cultural phenomenon, and naturally that incentivized good old Nintendo to go further with the idea and create more iterations of the Game Boy. The Game Boy Pocket and its first successor, the Game Boy Color, would follow shortly after, bringing Nintendo massive success and not to mention millions of dollars. Neither of those would be more commercially and culturally relevant than the next iteration of the handheld, the Game Boy Advance. Even though it wasn't as successful as the original Game Boy sales-wise, growing up, the Game Boy Advance always felt like the coolest thing in the world. It felt like the cooler older brother to my wimpy little Game Boy Color I had at the time. But enough fawning over the Game Boy Advance, because we're here to talk about failures. And unlike how great the Game Boy Advance is, the Game Boy Micro didn't even measure up. Announced at E3 2005 by the legendary Reggie Fils-Aimé, the Game Boy Micro was the Game Boy Advance's final iteration and Nintendo's attempt to make the Game Boy Advance more fashion-forward and more appealing to adults as opposed to the previously released Game Boy Advance SP. With its small form factor, interchangeable faceplates, and backlit screen, the Micro was designed to be the ultimate pocket-sized gaming experience at the time, but also be sleek and cool enough to be used by everyday adults. Of course though, it wouldn't be in this list if it was successful, so why did it fail? One of the biggest issues that players had with the Game Boy Micro was its lack of backwards compatibility with the original Game Boy. Unlike its predecessor, you couldn't just put your old Game Boy cartridges into your Game Boy Micro. Nintendo chose not to bring forward the backwards compatibility, likely because the focus on pocket sizing and the fact that the Game Boy SP filled that role. The biggest problem with the Game Boy Micro, and likely the reason why it failed, was the poor timing of its release. As I said earlier, the Micro was released in 2005, which is just 1 year after the release of Nintendo's next generation handheld, codenamed Nitro, or as we know it today, the Nintendo DS. Now you might be thinking, why would Nintendo release another iteration of the Game Boy Advance when this brand spanking new touchscreen handheld just dropped? Well, apparently Nintendo weren't very confident in the DS, as they viewed it as an experimental thing, so they wanted to continue to support the Game Boy Advance as something to fall back on. Little did they know, the DS went on to be a smash hit, selling 5.2 million units by the end of the fiscal year in 2005, only a few months after its initial release. The DS was also backwards compatible similarly to the Game Boy Advance SP, which meant there was little reason to buy the Game Boy Micro over the DS or even the Game Boy Advance SP. Even though the DS was a huge success, Nintendo wouldn't discontinue the Game Boy Micro until 2008, but ultimately it was never able to reach the sales numbers of its predecessor and was ranked number 8 in the online blog GamePro's list of the top 10 worst selling handhelds of all time. That list would also feature another device we're going to talk about, but we'll get to that later. All in all, the Game Boy Micro was a cool little device that was ultimately stifled by the success of its next generation counterpart. Years later, gamers mourn what could have been for the Game Boy Micro as they become more valuable on sites like eBay, with more people wanting to get their hands on one. Now, if Nintendo's Game Boy Micro was a case of bad timing, what Sony cooked up in their share of the handheld market in 2009 was a masterclass on how to confuse your own audience. Now, this entry is very much in the late 2000s, but I wanted to include it anyway because I always wanted to find out more about this little gadget. Sony's original PSP was already a huge handheld in the mid 2000s. It was basically a portable PlayStation 2 Lite that also happened to play movies and music and browse the web and also look futuristic doing it. I remember all my friends had one and they would let me borrow theirs since I didn't have one growing up. Playing games like Dissidia, Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep, Star Wars Battlefront, and everything was just so fun and just an unmatched experience. But by 2009, handheld gaming has shifted into this weird in-between era where smartphones were starting to get better, but dedicated handhelds still had a real place in the market. So Sony decided that it was time for a new iteration of the PSP that felt more modern and would be able to compete with the emerging smartphone market. That new iteration was the PSP Go, officially revealed in May 2009 via Sony's video-on-demand service known as Core, and released later that year as a premium redesigned version of the PSP. The big gimmick was right there in the name. It was meant to be more portable, more streamlined PSP you could take anywhere. So Sony ditched the UMD drive entirely, made the device smaller, and swapped the classic wide PSP shape for a slick sliding design that hid the controls underneath a 3.8-inch screen, similar to popular mobile phones of that era. It also introduced its biggest gimmick. The device was all digital, meaning you have to download your games from the PlayStation Store to the built-in 16 gigabytes of internal storage to play them. Not to mention all the movies and TV shows the previous model was known for carrying on UMD had to be converted to the PlayStation Store in order for you to watch them on the go. I remember seeing this version of the PSP growing up and thinking that it was basically just a slim version of the PSP, but boy was I wrong. But the question remains, why did this version of the PSP fail? Well, on paper, it sounds like Sony was just ahead of the curve. Digital games, internal storage, and a slick new design. But in practice, that redesign also meant that the PSP Go wasn't really a new PSP, so much as it was Sony trying to reinvent the PSP for a world that wasn't fully ready to go all digital yet, and for an audience that still loved their UMDs. Due to the all digital nature, not only was the lack of UMD support a problem, but the lack of content on the PlayStation Store for the device was also a problem. When the PSP Go released in October 2009, there were only about 300 PSP games available digitally on the PlayStation Store. While that may sound like a lot at the time, there were over 2,000 PSP games released for the handheld, so that was barely anything for the time. Combine that with a high price point of $250, when the PSP 3000 received a massive price cut from $200 to just $169 for a far more superior experience, and you can easily see why Sony stopped producing these things by 2011. While I think that the design and overall aesthetics of the PSP Go were super slick and beautiful for the time, the short-lived handheld was just not meant for the market at the time. Maybe if it had released in the current day with the advancements in internet speeds and uptick in all things digital, it would have stood a better chance of succeeding. Well, maybe if it was a bit bigger, but that's neither here nor there. Now, moving on from the ill-fated PSP Go, we're getting into another handheld device that preceded the PSP. We're going back to 2003. As I talked about earlier in this video, after the Game Boy was released, there was a growing obsession with handheld consoles. With the Game Boy Advance dropping in 2001, the original PSP, and the Nintendo DS dropping in 2004, the early 2000s was an amazing time for handheld gaming. But long before the PSP Go would make an attempt to create a bridge between mobile phones and handheld consoles, Nokia, the at the time popular phone company, would try their hand at creating a device that could serve as a phone and a handheld console all in one. That's right, we're talking about the Nokia N-Gage. Now, if we're talking about gimmicky devices of the 2000s, then the N-Gage is the definition. This taco-shaped mobile gaming console was released by Nokia in 2003 as an attempt to get gamers away from the ever-popular Game Boy Advance that was released 2 years prior. The way they tried to do that was by blending the best parts of a handheld console with the calling and texting of a mobile phone into one device. It used multimedia cards or game cards similar to an SD card to load games into the device, and because it was made by Nokia, it attracted multiple third-party companies to develop games for it. Due to that, we saw games like Sonic the Hedgehog, Tomb Raider, Super Monkey Ball, Spider-Man 2, and many more come to the system. However, why did the N-Gage fail? Even though it may seem like it was way ahead of its time, The N-Gage had its fair share of problems, and some of them were way too glaring to ignore. The first big problem with the device was the design itself. See, in order to play games on it, you have to essentially disassemble the entire thing because the games were loaded onto the back of the device behind the battery. And I don't know about you guys, but I'd rather not continuously disassemble a handheld to play a new game. That kind of defeats the entire purpose. Not only that, but the buttons were very small and the form factor itself just made it hard to play without giving you the meanest hand cramps. Ergonomically, it just didn't work. Another failure of its design is that the speaker and the microphone were at the top of the device, which meant to make calls you had to awkwardly hold the top of the taco to your ear for some reason. Not sure who at Nokia came up with this groundbreaking design, but needless to say, it didn't appeal very much to the average gamer at the time. Thus, the original N-Gage design was retired for the new QD model, which was meant to address all the design flaws of the original. Another issue besides the design itself was, of course, its pricing. The N-Gage launched at $299, which even back then was crazy. To put that into perspective, the PS2 was only $200 in 2003, and even worse, its direct competitor, the Game Boy Advance SP, you know, the whole reason the N-Gage was created in the first place, that released the same year was only $100. At that price, there was really no justifiable reason to buy the N-Gage over the Game Boy Advance SP because there was really no exclusive games for the N-Gage that made people say, yeah, I need that taco phone specifically to play this. By the time the QD model was released, it was too late as the world was no longer interested in the N-Gage. The QD model would only sell around 2 million units in the 2 years that it was around, and then the N-Gage would be laid to rest in 2006. And what's funny is, the idea itself wasn't crazy. A phone that can play games is literally the world that we live in now. The problem was that Nokia was just trying to invent 2012 technology using 2003 technology, and it wasn't pretty. Now, speaking of ahead of its time ideas that still somehow turned into a disaster, let's shift from handhelds to peripherals because the 2000s had a special talent for turning normal controllers into some of the weirdest, most outlandish accessories you've ever seen.
The world's a special place.
Cherish life and never waste.
Everyone loves a sunshiny day.
We're gonna keep it that way. Cause clean is better than dirty, and dirty's meaner than clean.
Let's all lend a helping hand. Mario can't do it alone. He'll spray his water to fly around and clean the sludge that's on the ground.
Cause clean is better than dirty, and dirty's meaner than clean.
Super Mario Sunshine, only for Nintendo GameCube. Rated E for everyone.
Since we've been talking about the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance a lot throughout this video, let's talk about some of the weird third and even first party accessories that were available for the handheld. If you grew up in the 2000s like me, you probably know about the Game Shark, the little device that allowed you to activate different cheats and commands from many different games on your console. But did you know that Nintendo actually created their own version specifically for the Game Boy Advance? Well, kinda. The e-reader was an accessory that released in 2002 here in the States for the Game Boy Advance that allowed you to scan special e-reader cards to do things like give yourself new items in a game, battle new trainers in Pokemon games, and play minigames. So it did a lot more than just activate cheats. It basically was a mini downloadable content machine before DLC was even a thing. Unfortunately, it wasn't very popular outside of Japan for some reason. Maybe it just didn't appeal to kids like they thought it would, so it would be discontinued in the US 2 years later in 2004. Growing up with a Game Boy, you take it pretty much everywhere you could, especially as a kid, so of course there was an accessory to keep your Game Boy holstered to your hip for your convenience. The Nyko hip clip was an accessory made by Nyko, known for creating third-party gaming accessories still to this day. The hip clip was for the Game Boy Color and it was obviously meant to clip to your hip. It clipped onto your belt loops and basically served as a holster for your Game Boy Color, allowing you to keep it on you at all times, ready for any schoolyard, Pokemon battle, or quick gaming session on the bus ride home. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like something a kid would absolutely beg their parents for, and that's exactly why it's such a perfect example of early 2000s accessory culture. It wasn't really solving a problem anyone had, it was just turning your Game Boy into a piece of gear, basically. It's one of those accessories that makes total sense as a novelty, but as an actual day-to-day thing, yeah, most kids probably tried it once and realized it was uncomfortable and impractical and just toss it in a drawer forever. Moving on to another Nintendo accessory, but a bit further in the future, we have the good old Wii. And when you think about the Wii, what's the game that you think of? You might say Super Smash Bros. Brawl or Mario Kart, or you might even think of the best-selling game for the Wii, which is the classic Wii Sports. Other than boxing, I think most people's favorite sport in the game is probably bowling. And surely no one playing Wii Sports bowling ever thought that they needed a controller specifically for bowling, right? Well, for some reason that exists. Yes, there is an entire controller made specifically for Wii Sports bowling. It's just a really big bowling ball shaped plastic shell that you insert your Wii remote in to help you roll the ball better. My first thought when seeing this was that you'll definitely end up throwing this into your TV, but lo and behold, it has a wrist strap like the actual Wii remote, so that doesn't happen, I guess. I don't think I have to say much more about this controller other than who was using this. I can't imagine being such a tryhard in Wii Sports that you have to pull out my bowling ball controller to beat my little sister in Wii bowling. But I guess I'm not the target audience. Needless to say, it wasn't a very popular peripheral. Now, of course, we can't talk about weird peripherals without talking about the Resident Evil 4 controller. Yes, that one. The one shaped like a chainsaw for some reason. So this is the Resident Evil 4 chainsaw controller for the GameCube version of Resident Evil 4, obviously. Yeah, for some reason, this third-party company named Nubitech decided to make a GameCube controller shaped like the chainsaw that the Chainsaw Man enemy carries. No, not that Chainsaw Man. Also, they made another one for the PS2 that was red, so it looked like the Chainsaw Sister enemies' chainsaws. Not sure why there needed to be two of these, but they're a collector's item now, and they're worth a good bit of money, most likely due to them being pretty rare. The utility of the controller seems to be pretty bad coming from people who own it, but I could have guessed that. I mean, just look at the button placement. But even though this is a pretty stupid peripheral, it just oozes with the quirkiness of the early 2000s, and I love it. Now, one of the sad failures of the beginning of the new millennium was the Dreamcast, Sega's final ever home console that I'll most likely talk about in another video one of these days. However, before the innovative console was discontinued in 2001, it had a peripheral that takes the words weird and niche to another level. This is the Dreamcast fishing controller, or as it's known in Japanese, the Suri controller. This controller was for fishing, obviously, but how many fishing games did the Dreamcast have to warrant this controller, you might ask? Well, the Dreamcast actually had 6 fishing games that were compatible with this thing, which were Bass Rush Dream, Lake Masters Pro, Real Fishing Wild, Sega Bass Fishing 1 and 2, and Sega Marine Fishing. Don't be fooled though, this controller was also compatible with 2 non-fishing games, which were Virtua Tennis and Soul Calibur. Yeah, I don't know how anyone was playing Soul Calibur with this, but it worked with it somehow. Needless to say, I don't think this was a very sought after controller unless you were really into fishing games or you just wanted to give yourself a handicap while playing Soul Calibur with your friends. And for our last weird peripheral flop, we're going to the very end of the 2000s to 2009. One of the most popular things in pop culture during the 2000s was extreme sports. Snowboarding, biking, and of course, skateboarding were at the peak of their popularity, and every kid wanted to be the next Tony Hawk or Ryan Sheckler. If you're anything like me, your entry into the world of extreme sports was through video games, especially the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and Underground series. I think I can speak for most of us watching this video when I say we loved these games and played the hell out of them. Unfortunately, toward the end of the 2000s, the Tony Hawk games started to kind of lose their luster. And that was most evident with the release of Tony Hawk Ride. To say this game was gimmicky would be an understatement. And if you want to know how, look no further than its exclusive controller, the Ride board. Yeah, this big hunk of plastic was the controller meant for this game, and man was it unpopular. On paper, it's pretty cool. You get the board, you do some tricks like a real skater. However, that's pretty far from how it worked in reality. The board used infrared sensors to detect your movements in game realistically, but pretty much everyone that used it found it to be inconsistent and barely responsive to any movements for tricks. Due to how utterly useless this controller was, it became known as one of the worst gaming peripherals of all time, which was pretty warranted if you ask me. I actually used this board once and yeah, it was just as bad as they say it was. The board was definitely a clunky hunk of plastic that embodies the era where companies were just trying anything, and even though it sucked, it was an interesting idea for the time before we had VR and all that stuff like that. Looking back on these failures of the 2000s does make me feel nostalgic for a time where the gaming scene was bold, unpredictable, and fun. It was a time where companies weren't afraid to take risks and try something new, even if it flopped hard and lost money. These days, a lot of companies, especially in gaming, are solely focused on what makes them the most money, that they don't try to innovate that much. Even things like the N-Gage or the PSP Go fell flat, but at least we can look back now and realize that they were ahead of their time. Because we all know in order to succeed, sometimes you're gonna have to fail. But let me know down in the comments if you guys own any of these products or if you have another that I may have missed. If you enjoyed this nostalgic look back, leave a like and subscribe to the channel because I have more videos like this coming. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.